This is Tar Heel Talk, an in-depth look at the issues and people making news in North Carolina. Here's your host, Sonia Williams.
According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, suicide was the leading cause of death in the U.S. in 2016, claiming the lives of 45,000 people. And with the recent passing of celebrities like Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, suicide is getting national attention. Today, we have experts on hand to discuss suicide, the warning signs, its causes, and how to help support someone who might be in crisis. And joining me today are representatives from Carolina Partners in Mental Health Care, Dr. James Smith, Medical Director and Managing Partner, and Matt Wolf, who is a licensed clinical social worker. Thank you both so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure.
Suicide is definitely, it's not something that's easy to talk about, but it's important to talk about, especially when you have such high-profile people who are committing suicide. Talk about some of the reasons why suicide is so important to discuss.
Matt, go right ahead.
Well, as you say, it is one of the leading causes of death. I believe it's number 10. And it's something that is actually contagious. When a suicide occurs, you get a swell of people calling into suicide hotlines. You, in some cases, get increases in the number of suicides. So it's very important that we address this issue in a very proactive way.
Claire, when we see the last 10 to 15 years, unfortunately, suicide has been increasing across all age groups. Wow. And it's societal changes and the mental illness are playing huge roles in the increases. About 45% of all ER visits that have some kind of injury are self-harm events, and they are also increasing.
And let's talk a little bit more about some of the causes of suicide. I know that you put together some information to share with our viewers about the causes of suicide. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I know the first one is that suicide is rarely caused by any single factor, but rather it's determined by multiple factors and often with no known mental condition. And I think that mental health condition, I think that's important for people to understand and to know that you don't have to suffer from mental illness to be a victim of suicide.
So true. I would venture to say right now the main cause for people taking their lives are breakups in relationships, financial losses, bankruptcies, illness, and about 55% of individuals that do commit suicide have those issues in addition to a mental illness. So it is really societal pressures a vast majority of the time.
And one of the aspects of that, what you find when you talk to people facing those issues, is they had never envisioned a life without either that partner or that financial situation or that job, and they simply don't have a map in which they can exist there. And a lot of what therapy does is try to help people redefine a life that can be rewarding and fulfilling even with that thing gone, whatever it may be, whether it be a relationship or a job, for example.
And therapy is so very important. I think sometimes it's taboo to admit that you're seeing a therapist or even to entertain the thought, but it's so important and it really could mean the difference between life and death for some people.
Well, most definitely. It's a situation now where, thank God, when I first started here in town 40 years ago, folks would run. If they found out I was a psychiatrist at a social event, they'd go the other way. But we have gotten a lot better. The stigma's still there. We haven't eliminated by any means. And thankfully, the availability of additional mental health professionals like Matt, myself, as this mental health therapy community has grown over the years, to access the services has improved.
And that's so very important for people. There are some other causes that I want us to take a look at as well that you prepared on the slide. You look at those without a known mental health condition suffered more from relationship, like you mentioned earlier, relationship problems and other life stressors, such as a criminal or legal matters, eviction, loss of a home, and recent or impending crisis. Those things, you kind of think of those and say, can you not toughen up and work through it? But sometimes it's just not that simple for people.
And one of the other sad situations, take what you just said and then throw in alcohol, throw in benzodiazepine, or even an antidepressant. And for that impulsive moment when you are depressed and you're under the influence of a drug or alcohol and life looks very bad, clearly one can, and you have availability of a firearm. That's a bad combination, a bad combination.
And you mentioned the attitude that a lot of us have that, well, why can't they just toughen up, as you say? And a lot of times that's actually a contributing factor because people are embarrassed and ashamed that they're overwhelmed and that they might need help. And so that contributes to their feeling of despair, unfortunately.
So what can we do as family members, as friends, as colleagues and coworkers? What can we do if we see someone who we feel like may be going through a crisis and going through a difficult time? What can we do to help prevent them from getting to that point?
I think it's very important to maintain an open line of communication as much as possible. Many times people who are depressed or facing things that are embarrassing or that are difficult do try to push away the social support that's actually going to help them. And I think it can be very helpful for people to know that, understand that, and really kind of try to push through that a little bit and try to make sure that that person is talking with someone.
I would only add that when you see a loved one isolating themselves and you have an inkling of some of the stuff that's going on in their life, when you see that isolation, start reaching out, start keeping an eye out. And if you see any increase in alcohol use during that time, double up your guard and definitely keep an eye on. Don't allow them to isolate.
And I've heard other people say, you know, sometimes people will give you warning signs. They will say things like, you know, I'm done, I don't want to live anymore, I'm tired. And people should take those sayings very seriously.
Most definitely. I think, in all honesty, to you, you never know.
Right.
And you never want to be the one to make a judgment call that says, I ignored what she said or he said because I didn't think they would do it. You don't know. And when you look at what we are seeing in America today, with it being the leading cause in some communities, please, everybody that's listening to this, take it seriously.
Absolutely, and the fact that it's on the rise is concerning and something that we should take seriously.
Absolutely.
Most definitely. Society has not gotten easier, but our kids bounce back a lot more than us. They're more resilient than us old 68-year-olds. I'm telling you. But still, it is a situation to encourage folks to seek help and be a good support system for those people around you, and you can make a difference.
Absolutely. We're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute. We'll be back with more information on suicide after these messages. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., and today we're taking a closer look at this issue. With us again is Matt Wolf, who is a licensed clinical social worker with Carolina Partners in Mental Health. Now, Matt, before the break, we were talking about some of the causes of suicide, and I know that a third cause that we wanted to discuss is someone who has an identified mental health condition and they've suffered from a relationship, a job, or financial or physical health problems. So talk a little bit about that and that being a cause.
Well, we know that depression and addiction are particularly problematic for people in terms of their suicide risk. We know that those people can endure lifelong risk for suicide, and it's something that they always have to be on guard for if they're conscious about their recovery. Bipolar disorder and other severe mood disorders are also important to keep an eye on. And when they're in combination, that's when you find the most risk, actually. When you find people who have an addiction and a severe mental health issue, such as depression or bipolar disorder, it actually is an exponential increase in terms of the amount of risk that there is involved. And professionals know to really confront these risks head on.
We spend a lot of time talking about the person who maybe has committed suicide, but We don't spend enough time, I think, talking about the people who are left behind, their loved ones, who may be beating themselves up for not doing enough. So let's talk a little bit about the people who are left and how to support those people.
Absolutely. You know, one of the top things that I hear from people who have been exposed to a suicide is, I should have known. Is this terrible guilt and sadness, this feeling of responsibility that they really should have known that this was coming. And what I try to impart to people is that even trained professionals are known to be terrible at assessing for the risk of suicide. In fact, the National Institute of Health has numerous research articles suggesting that we should do away with formal tools to assess risk for suicide, because they're not very effective and they're not very helpful.
Right.
So the last thing that a person should do is torture themselves thinking they should have been able to do that.
And again, I think that it's an extremely important point for people to understand that someone doesn't necessarily have to suffer from a mental illness to be impacted or at risk for suicide.
Absolutely. As we mentioned earlier, spontaneous events, things that come upon us suddenly that we were not expecting, that dramatically change our lives and our sense of our life, are very key in a lot of suicides. And nobody could have predicted that those would occur, of course.
Right. And I can imagine that family members put a lot of pressure on themselves to try to understand the reasons why someone, a loved one, may have committed suicide. That is something that someone like you can help them process.
Absolutely. You know, the struggle to understand that choice of suicide is something that we all face, because when we're on the outside of it, we can always come up with good reasons or good ways that they could have coped, right? Some other way must have existed for them to continue on. And it's easy for us to reason that. One of the hardest things to acknowledge is that when people are facing those thoughts, those darkest thoughts, they're oftentimes in a distorted kind of mind frame that amplifies their problems far beyond their ability to cope and makes it seem insurmountable. And from their space where they are, it can be hard to convince them otherwise. And so we have to understand that when we're trying to see it, we're seeing it from the outside of all of that.
Right.
And it looks very different to us.
So what kind of support, if you see someone who may be suffering and you want to reach out, you want to help, what kind of support can you offer to someone?
As a family member or a friend, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to maintain that openness and that dialogue. As Dr. Smith had mentioned, very often people will isolate, whether it be due to shame and embarrassment, whether it be because they feel completely overwhelmed and they want to isolate. Whenever we see that behavior, we definitely want to go in and try to help. Very often families will feel like, well, I want to give them their space. And although that can be helpful in short bursts, typically we want to be present and make sure they know that we're not going away. Absolutely.
It's important to maintain that connection. If you have lost someone to suicide, what type of support is available to help families process that?
Thank you. There are actually suicide support groups in many metro areas. But one of the things that I encourage people to do is to consider just going to a therapist or a counselor, maybe even a pastor in a counseling situation for a couple of sessions, just to kind of talk things out. And a lot of people with the stigma that we've mentioned will say, well, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need to see a professional. Right. And what I try to get across to them is, if someone you love has committed suicide, that means that something horrible has happened to you. You know, and just as we wouldn't fault a person for going to the emergency room after a car accident, there should be no shame whatsoever in seeking counsel when we've endured a very painful and traumatic event.
Absolutely, that support and that guidance, and like you said, that therapy is extremely important to help process and deal with a very traumatic issue. How can people find out more information about Carolina Partners in mental health and how to connect with you?
Well, of course, there's the carolinapartners.com website, which has our phone number, 919-929-9610, and intake person will provide them with the quickest appointment possible.
Absolutely, and that support, like I said, could mean the difference between life and death. We're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute. Don't go away. Tar Heel Talk will continue after these messages. Welcome back to Tar Heel Talk. I'm Sonia Williams. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. in 2016, claiming the lives of 45,000 people. And with the recent passing of celebrities like Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, suicide is getting national attention. My experts today have been educating us all about suicide, its causes, warning signs, and how to support people who might be in crisis. With us again are representatives from Carolina Partners in Mental Health Care, Dr. James Smith, Medical Director and Managing Partner, and Matt Wolf, Licensed Clinical Social Worker. Thank you again for both for being here. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have put together a lot of information, national reports on people who have committed suicide and some of those statistics. Let's take a look at that and just kind of talk about what we're seeing here.
Most of these statistics are right off the press. This was released on June the 8th.
Wow, okay.
And so what we see here is that about 75% of the people that have committed suicide had either a diagnosis of depression or had been depressed. As you also see, 31% had had some issue with substance abuse, which is still a significant contributing factor. It also worries me because it reduces your, it worsens your impulse control,
right,
and it makes you more vulnerable. And then as you also see, which is surprising, 54% were in mental health treatment. All right,
wow,
and so
that's
they
alarming.
were struggling, but still those outside circumstances like a breakup, financial, those kind of things still affect you whether in treatment or not. But they could have been in treatment because of that. And then when you look at the relationship issues, it's amazing how relationships are so impactful in one's life. And losing someone that you've loved or been very fond of can be a true loss. And then that last part was about the health. And this is what we start seeing in our other age groups, a little older, 50 and above. Medical conditions really make a difference. One big thing, however, is about 75% of suicides are males. And when you look at males, then it's about 85% are white males, ages 25 to 65, that are taking their own lives. African Americans, about 8%, and Hispanic, about 6%. So it varies, but again, we have seen a lot of folks that are struggling with depression, they're struggling with the loss of a loved one. And Matt can speak to the fact that sometimes when you're with a family member that has a disease of a depression, it can wear on you also, and they walk away from it.
Well, yeah, and when you combine some of these factors, if you imagine somebody in their 50s or 60s, for example, suffering with depression, and then they lose someone very important to them, maybe their partner, you can imagine how devastating and how hard that would be to envision the future without that loved one in that circumstance. So these factors that you've seen very often compound with each other to create a real severe risk.
Right. I think it's important if you are in a bad space,
yes,
and you are struggling with whether it's a relationship, loss of a job, some financial issues, or mental health issues, it's important to know that there are resources in the community that are available for people. Let's talk about those, because you have a list of those that I think that are available right here in the Triangle that people can reach out.
Certainly for our listeners, we have great resources here in town. Not every community is blessed like Wake County. Between Holly Hill Hospital, has been around forever. But the most importantly, the UNC Wakebrook is a crisis center that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can go in there, and they can also call, and they will guide you. You know, if you're a loved one and you're worried about a loved one, you can call, and they will give you some advice. Holly Hill Respond also do the same thing, and they will give you, as a loved one, advice about your loved one, and they're also open 24 hours a day. And we've been lucky that Triangle Springs is our most recent new psychiatric hospital. That just opened up a couple months ago, and they're also providing services.
Right. And that's really important. I want to give those numbers for the Wakebrook Crisis Center, 984-974-4913. And for Holly Hill Hospital, 919-250-7000. And then Triangle Springs that you mentioned, 919-746-8900. But it's important to know that, you know, there are so many resources available in the Triangle.
And to that point, just recently I've had some relatives up in New York, for example, who were dealing with something severe along these lines in mental health. And I tried to steer them to resources in their area, and they struggled for days and days and kept getting the answer, there aren't the resources that we have here in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Wow.
And so I really wouldn't want anyone to think that there isn't help available.
Correct.
And that's so important. When you're talking about providing that support for someone who is struggling, and I know a lot of times if you are in a, like I said, in a bad space, it's difficult to reach out for help. And that's why it's so important for family and friends and coworkers to know some of those signs to look for.
I'd also add, if you felt like the need to call a police, feel free to do that. We are blessed here in Wake County. We have what we call CIT officers. These are officers that have gone through 40 hours of community involvement training. And both the Sheriff's Department and RPD have many of their officers have gone through this mental health training. So if you ever needed to call a police officer, ask for a CIT officer.
Okay, that's a good information to know. When you're looking ahead at this being suicide being one of the causes of death that is on the rise, what are you as mental health professionals looking for to try to help stop this trend?
Well, if I could jump in, I would just say I want to thank you. Being able to come on this show and put this information out. We don't have many vehicles. You know, I can talk myself blue in the face, but folks like yourself really make a big difference for this community.
Okay.
And I absolutely will tag on to that. I've worked in crisis lines in various counties and done the best that I can in the front line. But really, this kind of information dissemination is very powerful.
Okay. And there were two other resources that were on the Seek Help information that you provided for us, and I want to make sure that we provide for our viewers. And then you can also tell us how people can find out more information about Carolina Partners in mental health.
That last one was Strategic Behavioral Health in Garner,
right
North
there.
Carolina. They do handle kids up to age 18. And then our obviously Carolina Partners in Mental Health Care, we're available. Unfortunately, we're not available for acute crisis, but we do have a mental health professional on call 24 hours a day for advice, and they will guide a person in acute mental health situation into the right direction.
Okay. We have less than a minute left in the program. I want to give you the last word. What would you say to someone who might be in crisis today in terms of seeking help?
Talk to somebody, please.
Absolutely.
Talk to somebody. And if you know your loved one is in a crisis, talk to them.
Absolutely. That connection is so important. Matt Wolf and Dr. Jim Smith, thank you so much
You're
for the work that you're doing, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you.
All right. That's it for this week's Tar Heel Talk. To comment on this or other episodes of the show, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or send us an email to tarheeltalk@fox50.com. I'm Sonia Williams. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.